Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And welcome to the second session of Islamicate book reviews. For those of you who are new, this is an opportunity for you to watch me interview Omar Anchassi about his very large collection of books. It was actually something I started up in conversation with my friend Omar to basically explore what he'd been reading lately. And so Islamicate book reviews, the title draws on a word that was developed by Marshall Hodgson famously. And he used it to describe aspects of Muslim society that were not strictly developed out of a religious dimension, but were sort of part and parcel of the broader Islamic culture or the broader culture of Muslim society. And we're kind of extending that sort of metaphor to include Islamic studies as a Western discipline. And so we'll be looking over the course of a weekly discussion, roughly hour long, at books from recent books that have come out in sort of academic presses from broadly the sort of arena of Islamic studies. And this week's book is going to be introduced by Omar in just a moment, but I wanted to just very briefly introduce myself and Omar. I'm Usama al-Azami. For those who are sort of new to the broadcast, I'm a lecturer at Oxford University, and Omar Anchassi is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Edinburgh. And we'd like to welcome you today to discuss a book by James Pickett, which has just come out, whose title is Polymaths of Islam.
So let me hold it up to the screen.
And
this is Cornell University Press's wonderful recent Polymaths of Islam, which is really an exploration of scholarly culture, networks of patronage, and even scholarly migration in Bukhara from the period approximately 1747 to 1920. It focuses mostly on this period, yes,
that's fine, and we'll basically, Omar, I will be giving Omar about 10 to 15 minutes to give his take on the book, which he is a very careful reader, as we will, those of us who know him know well. But inshallah, we'll benefit from his insights into the book in those 10 to 15 minutes. After that, I'll kind of engage him. I've not read the book. I started reading the book earlier today, but I've not read the book in as much detail as Omar will have. And so I'll be engaging in some questions based partly on my reading of the book and partly on the discussions that me and Omar have had so far. And that will go on for another 10 or 15 minutes. And then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. Now, people are more than welcome to ask questions and answers. Anything that you type up into the search bar, not the search bar, sorry. So if you're joining us from Facebook, you'd write in comments and those would show up for us. If you're on YouTube, you'd write in the chat bar, as far as I understand. And if you're on Twitter, I'm not entirely sure exactly. I think you might need to tweet. But in any case, please feel free to ask questions now. And we will pick them up. We'll be able to show them on the screen as we're dealing with them. And Omar and I are also very keen to receive any feedback from yourselves. So please feel free to share those. We won't necessarily sort of address them here, but it'll be useful for us to think about these things. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Omar. So please take it away, inshallah.
Sure. Well, thank you all for tuning in, and do keep sending in those suggestions. We find them very helpful. And this book, as I said, explores scholarly culture in Bukhara during the rule of the Mangit dynasty, which lasts all the way from the mid-18th century until the Soviet conquest of the city in 1920. And this book draws heavily on a wide range of sources, including many manuscript sources. So it is highly original. And he places Bukhara against the backdrop of what he terms the Persianate or Persian cosmopolis. And this is a kind of important conceptual point the book makes, and he draws on Sheldon Pollock's work on the Sanskrit cosmopolis. So the way that languages and ways of life and textual canons enjoy this kind of celebrity, widespread popularity across vast geographic regions. And It's a book that does many things. It stresses the many hats worn by scholars in Bukhara. Bukhara functioned as a kind of magnet for scholars who migrated from many other parts of Central Asia, also places like Siberia, Xinjiang, and to a lesser extent, the Volga-Ural region. And he talks about the kinds of social roles ulama played, the sorts of texts they read. And as in the title of the book, Polymaths of Islam, he mentions that ulama in this context were not simply scholars of, say, Islamic law, but they were also poets. They also played important roles in the Mangit bureaucracy, and really, to a great extent, monopolized cultural production in this context. Now, that hasn't always been true, as we know, in Islamic history.
Right.
But what you find among Bukharan ulama is really this collapsing of social roles and kind of textual and cultural competencies all into the being enfolded sort of into the ulama and their range of competence. So, for instance, Bukharan, so ulama and Sufis were not really distinct groups in this period, and many faqirs and other kinds of Sufis, qalandars actually would have had, most of them in fact, a madrasa background. And he discusses networks of migration, and one of the things I really like about this book is how he illustrates it very helpfully with charts and figures. This one is very originally done a heat map, if I can hold that up to the camera, depicting patterns of migration from Central Asia to Bukhara. And another one, because he draws very heavily on regional histories or city histories of Bukhara, this long-established tradition in Islamic scholarship, as well as biographical dictionaries known locally as tazkiras. So here you have a graph illustrating madrasa construction over time. You can't see the numerals perhaps, but it does give you a nice indication. And Bukhara really was a magnet and a kind of sink of scholarship. So by the turn of the 19th century, its population was about 100,000, which would have made it in the year 1800, one of the largest cities in the Islamic world for sure. Madrasa construction really boomed under the Mangit dynasty, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. Of course, like the rest of Central Asia, Bukhara fell under Russian rule in 1868, if I remember rightly. What is unique about Bukhara and the neighboring khanates of Khiva and Kokand, if I'm pronouncing those correctly, is they retained a kind of semi-autonomous status within the Russian Empire. Unlike other Muslim territories, such as the Volga-Ural region, Kazan and Tatarstan and so on. And that meant that scholarly culture continued to flourish under Russian rule, really until the Bolshevik period. And because of this semi-autonomy, and in fact, Russian rule in many cases actually strengthened the Mangit emirs' control of their hinterland, the building of railway networks and so on, actually facilitated migration to Bukhara and strengthened these trans-regional networks in many respects. Crucially, because the Mangit emirs were left almost to their own devices, patronage continued. And that is why this particular model and style of scholarship continued to its importance. In terms of Islamic law, and I'm aware that there have been a lot of important recent publications on Islamic law in Russian and Soviet Central Asia by, for instance, Paolo Sartori and Nathan Spanos and many others. We're really enjoying a flourishing of scholarship on Muslim Central Asia in this later period at the moment. Right. But for instance, Qadi courts did have complete jurisdiction over law. And we know that the had punishments, for instance, in the late 19th century were enforced for offences like the drinking of wine. And a British intelligence official interestingly mentions that the punishment of stoning for adulterers was carried out now and then. It doesn't seem to have been extremely rare in this context. now I don't want to come across as completely uncritical, but this is a remarkable work because of its range, the kinds of sources it draws on, and the claims it makes, which really, it tells us more broadly about the relevance of post-classical models of scholarship in the Bukharan context. So he does compare and contrast, say, what was going on in the Ottoman Empire in the same period, and you did not have a huge amount of migration, certainly not from Istanbul, say, to Bukhara in this period. But in terms of the kinds of texts and the canon that scholars studied, there were large overlaps with the South Asian Dars in al-Azami. So the Hidayah was the most influential legal text.
So these were all thoroughly Hanafi.
Yes, and you would not be able to secure appointment as a Qadi unless you were a Hanafi, or at least implemented, Hanafi vision of law.
Right.
Alongside this, I should say, as well as the Arabic corpus, which included, as is true of much of the Sunni world in this period, at least in its eastern half, texts like Baydawi's Tafsir and the Mishkat al-Masabih, this hadith kind of compendium. But Persian texts and Persianate learning were supremely important.
Right.
And the study of the Divan of Hafiz, for instance, was tremendously important part, often pursued as a sort of elective or postgraduate aspect of the curriculum. But what is the form of knowledge and culture that a Bukharan or alim who lived in Bukhara had to master to be regarded as competent? It was a kind of Perso-Islamic learning, not only the Diwan of Hafiz, but also the Hidayah of Marghinani. So it's an interesting world, and there are important parallels, but also important distinctions between the scholarly culture of Bukhara in this period and, say, Istanbul and Delhi and Lucknow and what have you.
And I mean, what you've described in many respects strikes me actually as not too dissimilar from the forms in which the Dars and the forms that the Dars and Azami might have taken in the 19th century, which was at that point. In a sense, Persian was the lingua franca of Islamic sort of scholarship.
Yes,
and so
yes.
It makes me wonder to what extent is this tied in with, Indo-Islamic culture and the Mughal Empire as well.
Very good. So James Pickett does a wonderful job of discussing these networks, and occasionally the flow, the migration of scholars and books happened in one direction, but not in the other. So, for instance, yes, you would have Bukharan ulama who settled in Istanbul, but it didn't really happen the other way around. He points out that I should say Bukhara is, yes, Persian Arabic were the languages of high culture. Persian was the language of administration in the Bukharan Emirate. Right. Something that only changes in the 20th century. But the Mangit dynasty, these were Turkic military elite. So kind of pattern we find very commonly in the Islamic world after the Mongol conquests is, a Persian, especially in the eastern half of the Islamic world, as I said, a sort of Persianate cultural elite, or Perso-Islamic cultural elite, who did, of course, master Arabic text as well, combined with a Turkic sort of military political elite. And
which again sounds to me very much like basically the Mughals.
Yes, and there are important parallels. Now, important parallels with South Asia. I mean, he does say, for instance, lithographic texts produced in South Asia did circulate in Central Asia and Bukhara specifically, which is quite interesting because he also notes that Turkic texts written and printed in Istanbul did not circulate in Bukhara in the 19th century. So Bukhara was a kind of regional center of Persianate culture, but there were rival and in many cases larger and more kind of prestigious centers of Persianate culture, including, say, for instance, Istanbul. And of course, the Qajar Iran and Iran later is a bit more complicated because of the sectarian dimension. I mean, sectarian identity did not quite work in the same way. But for instance, your Hanafi training would be useless in Iran, in Qajar Iran, and similarly. So those were the kinds of barriers that mattered. In terms of Sufism, Pickett says that the Naqshbandi Mujaddidis were basically the only game in town, but it was very common to collect multiple Sufi affiliations and lineages. But as I said, the ulama and the Sufis were not distinct social groups, and the tensions you might find in other contexts are really not here. And that's partly because the scholars, again, to invoke the title again, were Polymaths of Islam. These were, if you were a poet, you were probably an alim. And not only that, this extends to even the occult sciences, which were cultivated by ulama in Bukhara. Including
in there's an aspect of post-classical Islam as well that Ahmed talks about. Yes,
so
and the occult was also cultivated. Yeah.
Of course, and especially in the scholarship of people like Matt Melvin Kuski. These were certainly in the context Pickett talks about, whether it's geomancy, Ramel, letterism, Jafar, and so on, even alchemy. And so these were considered intellectually respectable. They were cultivated by a relatively small number of Bukhara.
They have been looked at askance by some of the jurists and theologians, perhaps? Or
no, in the Bukharan context.
In the Bukharan context, no.
Not at all. Not at all.
Because you do have that dimension in the other parts, in the Middle East.
Of course. Now, yes, how should I put this? Pickett says explicitly, geomancy and letterism were not considered forms of sorcery or sihr.
Right.
And you would not lose prestige as alim. And there's something we find across the post-classical Islamic period. Much earlier on, once, say, for instance, astrology and astronomy begin to diverge, or at least become distinct branches of knowledge from about the 10th century of the Common Era onwards, you do find ulama who embrace astronomy while being critical of astrology.
Yes.
And you find plenty of criticism of letterism and other things. It seems to have diminished, as far as I can tell, in the post-classical period. In the Bukharan context in particular, this critique seems to be largely absent. And, that's of a piece with...
familiar sort of viewers, for less familiar viewers, do you want to elaborate slightly about the concept of letterism? What exactly?
Yes, so I'm by no means an expert in any of these branches of knowledge, but letterism, both things like letterism and geomancy, these are, I would guess, primarily forms of prognostication, of predicting the future, or divining auspicious signs. Should I pursue this course of action? Should I do that other action? It's a bit like, if I can trivialize it. You used to get in the 1990s these big 8 balls that you would shake, and then a solution would appear. You should do this. You shouldn't do it. Okay, it's a much more intellectually sophisticated version of that. So geomancy involves. I actually know very little about it. It's to do with particular marks on the ground and all of this. Letterism is. The alphabet, each letter corresponds to a particular number, and the numeric values can be significant, and anyway, and so on. But if you look at, there's lots of scholarship on this now. Matt Melvin Kuski, Liana Saif, and others have written a lot about this.
Right. So I'm going to actually encourage viewers, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. So far, I haven't received anything in particular, but I'm going to if it's okay with yourself, Omar, I'm going to perhaps divert the conversation in certain directions, which seem interesting and
good. But hopefully viewers now have a broad sense of what the book is viewing. Of course, there are many things going on.
Right. And it's also, I think, valuable to get a perspective. A lot of us, when we study Islamic studies, it's historically been very Middle Eastern centric. And so, there's been this move within the field to try and look at sort of areas which have been ignored. And very often these areas have great richness. South Asia is one of those areas that someone like myself will have natural affinities to. But again, places like Mawara an-Nahar, although he avoids that term, but the Bukharan sort of milieu, are something of a black hole, especially since I think someone like myself of Bangladeshi heritage can come into sort of the diaspora in a place like the UK, pursue Islamic studies, and then let my heritage, in a sense, direct my interests to a certain extent. But you don't have very much of that from those regions, and particularly after the sort of communist era, when they were part of the Soviet bloc.
Now, there are some brilliant, and I've been reading a fair bit about Central Asia recently. There are many reasons for that neglect. Part of it is the historical privileging of the sort of Arabo-Islamic elements of Islamic culture, which I'm by no means averse to, and that's what I find most interesting.
It's the bread and butter of most of us.
Of course. So there are, the discipline has particular traditions and trajectories and histories, and these have influenced. Of course, now, what's been written about most. Now we're fortunate to be in this period where you find scholarship on neglected periods of the post-classical period, especially from the 14th century onwards, that had received short shrift for most of the 20th century and before, and regions as well. So in particular, places like Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and others. And this is really a wonderful development to be, and many fine scholars undertaking work in, as indeed Pickett himself, dusty manuscript libraries in Central Asia. As you indicated, Usama, very correctly, in Central Asia there is an additional element, which is across the Muslim majority world, you had disruption in the 19th and 20th centuries. The degree of rupture in Soviet Central Asia is especially pronounced. And in the epilogue, he really does kind of wax lyrical about this. And he says, for instance, a alim in Bukhara in the year 1800 would have much more in common with his scholarly peers in, say, the 1300s than in 1950, just 150 years afterwards. So the degree of rupture is very dramatic. Persian, but although Islam survives, of course, and throughout the period, after some initial attempts to suppress Islam and other religions, eventually the Soviets give up trying to do that. They realize it's a hopeless cause. But at the same time, the Persian cosmopolis that Pickett talks about so much, knowledge of Hafiz, the cultivation of Persian as a language of culture, dies in almost all of Central Asia, except in Tajikistan, where it sort of becomes a national language and is written in the Cyrillic script. But this Persian cosmopolis is killed by the Soviets. And he never.
Pardon my ignorance. I mean, in Bukhara today, so then they don't speak a variant of Persian. I mean, Tajik is not a variant of Persian.
Tajik is, but that situation is unique to Tajikistan, and it's not referred to as Persian. It's called the Tajik language, and it's written in the Cyrillic script.
Right, of course.
We find, in fact, as far as I can tell, all Islamic languages were written primarily, if I'm not mistaken, in, say, the year 1900. In a variant of the Arabic script. All languages, with Albanian, with Somalian, with...
Even you find manuscripts in Bangladesh where Bengali is being written in Arabic script.
Yes. So that is very normal. Things change really because of national... I mean, it's a shame it doesn't allude to Zahab Ahmed and the Balkans to Bengal complex, but you can really see elements of that sort of in the background in terms of the forms of scholarship cultivated, the texts that were popular. So when he talks about ulama executive or sultan relations, Tursi's political thought was very influential. And also, again, going back to post-classical Islamic culture, this tradition of sacred kingship was very much alive in this context. So, the Sahibi Quran, the Lord of the Auspicious Conjunction, things I find deeply distasteful, but nonetheless.
Yes, I mean, you've expressed your distaste for some of this stuff in the past, but I mean...
Not the book, I should emphasize, not the book. The book
not the book, no, of course. But I mean, these are just comments about certain aspects of, Islamicate culture of those times, which strike some of us as quite bizarre and perhaps at odds with Islamic culture proper in our reading.
Of course, this is very much debated in scholarship, and it's a good thing that the sort of Orientalist with a capital O tendency to emphasize the decadence and the lack of originality. This has been basically dismissed, but for instance, in Ahmed Shamsi's book, and I don't want to make the book or to misrepresent the book as making claims it doesn't make. He is focusing on a particular geographic context. But he critiques, towards the end of that book, a kind of tendency to overreact against the Orientalist tropes on post-classical culture, and says, well, this isn't purely an invention of people like Muhammad Abdu. Actually, if we look at in Egypt, which is the context he focuses on more than Egypt and the Levant, we do find that manuscript holdings were impoverished in these areas, and that scholars did have quite narrow textual horizons and did produce quite particular styles of writing, commentary and Hawasi and all of this. That again, fairly limited horizon. So we have to sort of balance these competing perspectives.
I want to come back, hopefully, to a discussion of the interlinking with Ahmed Shamsi's conception of the post-classical. And I just want to remind viewers, if you have any questions, please feel free to sort of ask in the chat.
I'm very happy to keep talking.
But I actually, I'm perfectly happy actually to sort of ask. I have a series of questions actually which I wanted to ask, and let me begin with one which I think a lot of our viewers may actually be thinking about as well. That we're looking at Bukhara, and Bukhara has a certain resonance within sort of the Muslim global Sunni sort of community because of Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari. But even to this day, I mean, I'm reminded of a photo taken by Jonathan Brown in his Misquoting Muhammad, where he shows, a bride visiting sort of the shrine of Bukhari.
He says it seems to be a popular site for weddings or wedding photos.
For it's an auspicious site. We want to take barakah and things like that. So, in a sense, the question would be, to what extent is that link to Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari, who dies, of course, 256 of the Hijri calendar, 870. So centuries before like 1,000 years before the period that we're thinking about, to what extent is he still valorized? And is there, because I remember reading in the introduction the notion of the myth of Bukhara.
Yes.
And I didn't get to the point where he was actually elaborating what that meant. Was that linked?
That's a fantastic question. Now, al-Bukhari himself barely features, I think not at all, in the book. He does talk extensively about the myth of Bukhara, which becomes particularly strong in the colonial period, and he's somewhat. Well, not sarcastically, but Bukhara today is a sort of museum of the Uzbek national heritage, effectively. It's a sort of museum city.
Right.
And yes, Bukhara was never a cultural backwater. We're fortunate in that from its Umayyad conquest, it wasn't conquered by the caliphs.
The Mongols did run riot through it, as far as I recall.
Good question. So the Mongols did not destroy the city. Ibn Battuta in the 14th does deliberately avoid staying there, but unlike neighboring cities in Central Asia, it was not destroyed. Yes, the Mongols did enter it 3 times, I believe he mentions.
Right.
And Bukhara was never a cultural backwater, but Pickett stresses its fortunes did fluctuate. It was often overshadowed, especially in the Timurid period, for instance, by Samarkand, which was the Timurid capital. And Balkh and other Central Asian cities like this were often more important. Now, it really comes into its own immediately before the Mangit dynasty takes power in the mid-18th century. But it sees its greatest cultural flourishing in the Mangit period. And he talks about whether it's madrasa construction and even the historic buildings. He said most of the historic buildings of Bukhara do not predate the 16th century, and most of them are, even later than that.
It's intriguing.
So it's a wonderful exercise in, I don't want to say demythologization, that's quite radical, but yes, scholars did.
In a sense, because we think of the sort of architecture of Bukhara and the sort of the blue coloring, for example, that is associated with that part of the region. And my understanding is art historians connect a lot of that to sort of Mongol culture.
I should show this wonderful map he has of Bukhara.
Yeah, it's very
Now,
difficult.
yes, but you get a sense of it. I mean, like any Damascus or other by the standards of modern cities, it's a rather small place. But by pre-modern, 100,000 is a very respectable population size at the beginning of the 19th century.
Absolutely.
And Bukhara plays, notwithstanding the fact that Istanbul, of course, dwarfed it, both in terms of population and as a center of scholarship. But Bukhara played an oversized role. For instance. Relative to its size, say compared to Istanbul. So when you think, for instance, that by the late 19th century, there were between 150 and 200 madaris in Bukhara, in which between 4,000 and 7,000 students studied.
At any one time.
Yes,
that's an industrial scale. That is
right, but this makes it really a kind of
incredible. Yeah,
it puts it on the map in
but it also, I mean, in a sense, what you again, I don't have an objection to the myth of Bukhara as a term, because this is what scholarship can do. Once you're producing that much scholarship, you can then create a narrative about who you are, about your identity, about
precisely, and this kind of cultivation of, the writing of city histories is, of course, a very old genre, and you get your first examples in, well, I would guess, no later than the third Islamic century. But scholars in the Mangit period produce, reams and reams of, and that Pickett draws on extensively, biographical dictionaries and tazkiras and city history. So, of course, as with any other city, you have the fabrication of hadith on the virtues of Bukhara.
Right.
Bukhara Sharifa.
Very unsavory, but...
And tombs of prophets. So the tomb of Job was an important site of pilgrimage. And the tombs of local scholars like the Mahbubi, Sadr Sharia al-Mahbubi. I mean, the Mahbubi dynasty, it's really a dynasty of scholars. But you get this kind of, he has a whole chapter really devoted to the subject of the creation of...
I apologize if you can hear my 2-year-old speaking, by the way, in the background. But yes.
That's all right, it happens.
Right. I think that's truly fascinating. And the scale that you're speaking about in terms of, it really strikes, if there's 150, I'm sure it's
and
not.
Some of these would be tiny.
Some of them will be smaller, more sort of boutique madrasas, shall we say? but 150 centers of scholarship is not in a single
not to look down one's nose at. But yes, this means Bukhara was a major, regionally speaking, at least a major scholarly center. Absolutely. And why did this happen? Pickett emphasizes madrasa construction increased during the Mangit period quite dramatically, especially even under Russian rule. This stuff is happening.
And what were the motivations behind that sort of growth? Do you have any
I suppose the motivation in any other period for madrasa and mosque construction, legitimacy for rulers and patronage of culture and so on. The political elites themselves would have received a basic madrasa education, and then they were, and very occasionally they did themselves excel in scholarship. The rulers of Bukhara, but
fascinating. More so than other parts of the Islamic world in Islam.
Yes, and I would. Well, that's hard to assess, at least for me. But again, why did this happen? Because there was a scholarly culture. You didn't have these bifurcations between ulama and Sufis as social groups, between the poetry of Hafiz and Marghinani's Hidayah. It was one scholarly culture that rulers could to some extent participate in and certainly patronize or bestow patronage on. And by the 1900, Bukhara had about 350 mosques, which is, as far as I understand, a similar number to what London, that great city of Islam, has today.
So I'm going to take the conversation in a direction that, again, you may view with slight distaste without an academic hat on. But, this is also a period, the post-classical period, which celebrates Akbarian Sufism. And so when you're talking about sort of the ulama all being Sufis, and Central Asia also has great Sufi figures like Jami in particular comes to mind, but just a whole host of figures from a number of turuq. to what extent, we've talked, separately about a figure like Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi, and the way in which he, to a certain extent, is a polymath of Islam. He's a Sufi, he's a faqih in the Hanafi madhab, he's a poet, he's a mystical poet, and very talented individual, but steeped in this Akbarian sort of world, which has all sorts of tensions, obviously, with the exoteric forms of Islam.
Well, you and I might say that, but if you were an Ottoman member of the Ottoman religious elite or a Bukharan, certainly not. I mean, this was part of their world, their scholarly world.
Right.
I mean, Ibn Arabi does not figure in the book almost at all, but I will say that from the outset, I mean, going back to Sirhindi himself, of course, Akbarian Sufism was an essential dimension of this Naqshbandi Mujaddidi. I know it was a particular take on that tradition, but I mean, Akbarian Sufism was not marginal in Islamic life, religious, cultural life at all.
Right.
I mean, in the Ottoman context, you're talking, especially after their conquest of Damascus and Egypt and so on, 16 to 17. Right. It's the Ottomans who first, if I'm not mistaken, who who make Ibn Arabi's tomb a major kind of religious site in Damascus. And there is actually some scholarship on the Ottoman reception of Ibn Arabi. The name escapes me, but it's an important PhD dissertation. I can perhaps send you the link.
Let me know later. Yes, I mean, in a sense, let me wear. So just on the sort of discovery of the tomb, as far as I recall, it was basically one of the. I don't know if Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi himself had to do with it, but basically...
No. This is centuries before.
Right.
It was, and Abdul Ghani's, dies in the 18th. And,
yes.
16th.
But I mean, in a sense, the rediscovery of these sorts of tombs through the process of kashf to a certain extent, right?
Yes, and Ahmed al-Shamsi in his book has an excellent discussion of the so-called tomb of Hussein, which I think is a model for how this kind of scholarship should be done, in the sense that it's pure mythologization. I mean, there's no... I wouldn't be surprised if there's no reference to the tomb of Buhari before the 20th century or something like this. It's really not surprising. And it's true of any part of the Islamic world. Even Mecca itself, people complain about the destruction of the tomb of Hazrat Khadija. But I really wonder if people identified the tomb of Khadija before the 19th century or something. I mean, this is my particular perspective on things.
Sure. I mean, I think there are slightly separate problems of the destruction of heritage, which could be a place where research could take place of great value. And also...
that's one particular way of conceptualizing these spaces as heritage, kind of. The tomb of Job in Bukhara would have been an important site of pilgrimage and devotional practice. And one thing Pickett mentions is, in Bukhara at least, and I would guess more widely in Central Asia, tombs would be marked with sort of staffs with sort of animal horns and horse tails, very kind of almost shamanistic practice. So that's just interesting.
I remember, forgive me, I forget his name. This is, I believe, Carol Hillenbrand's husband, who's a great art historian from the University of Edinburgh.
Robert Hillenbrand.
Hillenbrand, forgive me. So obviously, I speak to someone from the august institution of the University of Edinburgh. But he gave a lecture at Oxford last year where he presented sort of some of the, the military paraphernalia of the Mamluks. And what was striking is the use of animal imagery and these sorts of things as, part of the heraldry of those cultures in a way that you would also expect to see in sort of European heraldry, historically speaking. So, I think, and, I certainly know from the Hanafi madhab, these sorts of things were seen with a certain degree of benign sort of disregard generally.
There is some great scholarship on images in Islamic law. And art historians have a slightly different take on this, and Christian Gruber and others have written on this. But from an Islamic legal perspective, the book by Ahmed Rabin, Hisba Arts and Crafts, is very good. There's a great discussion by Jamal Ilyas in Aisha's Cushion. I think that's by Jamal, and indeed others. But yes, you're right. Jurists were almost uniformly critical of certainly three-dimensional images, and the great majority of them also two-dimensional images of living things. There's something that only really changes at the end of the 19th century, in the early 20th. Muhammad Abduh had a fatwa that was very influential in this respect. And of course, in the late 19th century, you have extensive debate about photography. Many of the works on this still in manuscript.
Fascinating. But I mean, I was kind of alluding to the fact that certain types of imagery, when it's sort of considered to be insignificant on a coin, for example, I mean, the early Muslims used the coins of the Byzantines for the long, for a very long period. And
they did replace them quite quickly.
They did replace them, but it took quite a few decades, if I recall correctly. And so, but the fact that they did replace them does indicate something as well. I mean, when I studied in sort of a Darul Ulum setting, if I recall correctly, the discussions we used to have sometimes in the mudhakara, I remember being told that in the Hanafi madhab, it was generally considered, if you saw it on the ground from standing and you couldn't really discern its limbs, then that was too small to be a relevant concern.
Yes, I mean, jurists have all kinds of discussions of the details. Yes. Some say if it lacks anything that gives it life, then this is fine. Others say it's too small, or if it's a kind of contemptible place, like on the floor or in the curtain, this is fine. And they have all kinds of disagreements about the details, what's acceptable and what's not. But as a rule, according to this almost universal understanding of jurists, one should not be producing images of living things. But I fear we're getting a bit off topic.
No, I mean, I think that's perfectly fine.
Not to say that such did not happen, and Shahab Ahmed indeed has an excellent discussion of this in What is Islam?
And I, this kind of goes back to last week's discussion with Kevin Reinhardt, where you have the sort of standard Islam, the coining and the dialect, and I think in many respects, all those aspects, jurists kind of upheld a certain type of standard Islam, but a lot of the time in practice, they would have recognized the artificiality of aspects of those sorts of things when it comes to dealing with practice, I think.
Yes, it's a good point. And I should emphasize that our comments on images really pertain only to Sunni ulama, as far as I can establish. I'm much less well informed about religious iconography among Shia, which of course is a major subject.
So I wanted to sort of switch gears slightly. We've got about 15 minutes left perhaps, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a dimension which I got a flavor of in the introduction. But I think, as someone who's read the book, you will have looked at very detailed discussions about relations with rulers.
Yeah.
Specifically sort of the way in which, and I'm personally interested in this because of my own work on, oppositional ulama specifically. And I sort of wonder, there's acts of patronage, and people like Mehatina have really extensively discussed the way in which scholars also formed, oppositional groups in which they demanded the rights of the disenfranchised in society and made sure that, the rulers didn't overstep their own prerogatives and try and usurp the wealth of, for example, the poor. And I wonder if you can comment on exactly how this is, brought out, maybe not that particular dimension, but how it's manifested in Pickett's book.
Great question. There's one wonderful chapter in the book on ulama Emir relations. Now, there is this trope, as you said, of resistance. You find it in all kinds of sources to rulers and their authority, and that does actually happen. It's not made up.
Right.
And it was a virtue many scholars sought to cultivate and so on. Right. But in some sense, society if that is the norm, society cannot actually function. So just as Qasim Zaman points out when writing of the Proto-Sunni elite and the Abbasids, the norm was actually cooperation rather than confrontation.
Absolutely.
And the basics of religious life, like the enforcement of law and justice and so on, would have been impossible without this collaboration. So he does note occasional moments of tension and conflict, but the norm is collaboration and patronage. And it's really accentuated because of the extent to which rulers and ulama in this Bukharan context were really participants in the same culture. They appealed to and recognized many of the same norms, and many of the tensions you find when it comes to, for instance, enforcement of law, siyasa, justice, and in particular, mazalim courts and these sorts of things that enforced norms that could sometimes at least be regarded as extra Islamic or even non-Islamic.
Right.
There was no mazalim jurisdiction in the Bukharan context. So, although Bukharan ulama were not bureaucratized, they were not they were not centralized and co-opted by the state in the same way as happens in the Ottoman period. And I think the Ottoman case in the pre-modern Islamic world, as far as I can tell, seems to be more or less unique.
Yeah.
And Abdurrahman Attal has written about this, and it begins really after the conquest.
Where has he written about this?
Attal, it's a book, Scholars and Sultans, I believe it's called. It's Cambridge University Press. Right. That's a process that begins really after the conquest of Constantinople, but the creation of a learned hierarchy, the Ilmiya, and particular way of organizing madaris and hierarchization and so on. Now, you do find things in the Ottoman context that you find in Bukhara, like important scholarly dynasties that in this period seem to have almost monopolized higher religious offices, like the post of Sheikh al-Islam, which effectively meant the most important scholar in Bukhara as recognized by the emirs.
Right.
The post of chief qadi, and you also had the muhtasib and so on, other posts too in the religious important religious offices. But it's not as bureaucratized and centralized as happened in the Ottoman context. And to a great extent, because they are participants in the same culture, because rulers are such great patrons of learning. To some extent, the involvement of Russia does have an impact on this, because it gives rulers more independence in their authority, because the Russian Empire has guaranteed their territorial integrity in some sense and their rule across the hinterland. Right. So in the late 19th century, they're able to kind of play ulama families off each other to one extent that wasn't quite as possible before. But for the most part, the pattern is one of collaboration, fruitful collaboration, I'd say.
Yes. I mean, one of the things, the impression I get from your description of the Russian situation is that, a lot of the time the ulama provide legitimacy to the ruler.
Absolutely. Yes.
But the thing is, if the Russians are now, in a sense, dealing with the security of their suzerain, so to speak, then the ulama become a little less important, and you can play them off one another. Maybe I don't know if that's a dimension of this as well.
It's the reason that, and I should stress, what happens in Bukhara and Khiva is unique among Muslims in Russia. So, compare the Volga-Ural region in what's today Tatarstan, further west. Right. And Nathan Spanos has written a lot of important scholarship on this.
Right. I look forward to
we should probably devote an episode to his book, which is really cool as well. Future episodes. So what happens, Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand, the three Khanates, become sort of, they're kind of left semi-autonomous. Kokand later becomes, subject to direct Russian rule. But Bukhara and Khiva, in the 1860s, 70s onwards, basically are left almost to their own devices. Right. Of course, Russia does have overall authority, but for instance, compared to the Volga-Ural region, where Muslim religious elites become integrated into this Russian kind of bureaucracy, the spiritual assembly of Orenburg, for instance, does not happen in Bukhara. So they're not subject to Russian rule in at all the same way in Bukhara. And that's why this scholarly culture, the Persianate cosmopolis, continues to flourish up until Soviet rule. And it's really Soviet rule that changes everything. I don't think there was, of course, modernization and so on. The advent of the Jadid reformist movement was important, although they remained quite marginal until...
Sorry, the Jadid reformist movement, if you can elaborate a little on that.
And Adib Khalid has written extensively on them. They're sort of the Central Asian analog of reformist movements you find across the Islamic world in the late 19th century onwards, comparable to Abdu and so on. Of course, there are important distinctions between these movements. I don't want to say they're all the same. but they share some priorities at least, and they do to an extent read each other's scholarship. And Tatar scholars in elsewhere in the Russian Empire were very avid readers of Al-Manar, for instance.
Right. Yes. Well, Al-Manar has a reputation. I think quite a deservedly international reputation.
Yes, and this is not.
Scholars would be awaiting its publication, and would publish in it as well.
And indeed others as well, of course.
I wanted to actually sort of maybe throw in a comment and perhaps a reflection. I mean, it's speculative on my part, but
sure.
Sometimes I think it's important to point out the way in which when I say that the ulama, to a certain extent, function as a legitimating force for the rulers. I want to make important distinctions. I just finished sort of editing a chapter on Abdullah bin Bayya, right, in a book which I hope to publish next year. And the sort of legitimation that is taking place in that relationship with, for example, the United Arab Emirates is dramatically different, in my estimation, to the sorts of legitimate legitimation, if you permit the phrase, that is kind of necessary for the proper functioning of a state and of a society based on that form of governance and rule of law. And so what you have is, I mean, I'll take an example which is a non-Islamic example because of its familiarity to us. But if we think about the United States government or the British government and the way in which universities and particularly elite universities tend to be feeders for the major institutions of state, it's not that they are then, the universities are acting in some mercenary fashion for the purpose of the state to be able to get their money back or something like that. But there are these symbiotic relationships which are kind of natural and mutually legitimating,
of course,
which permit that sort of.
And I should stress that the nature of this relationship is dynamic. So
absolutely,
what you find in Buhari
as well.
Of course,
in the modern period, the state has the upper hand almost by default.
But for instance, Thomas Bauer talks about the ulama. I believe it's the ulamaization of the bureaucracy in the Mamluk period.
Right.
So in the early Abbasid period, there was a distinction between kutab, the secretarial class, and ulama, if you can speak of them. Right. But in other contexts, these disparities were kind of much more muted or even absent. Bukhara is one example of this.
Right. I'm less familiar with that distinction between the kutab and the ulama, and perhaps, I mean, we have another perhaps 8 minutes or so, but do you mind sort of spending a little moment on the distinction before?
I think it's under-researched, although a former colleague at Exeter, Istvan Christo Nazi, is actually working on this.
Right. I know him, yes.
And difficult to stress the tensions because people like Ibn Qutaybah were reputable scholars of hadith, and they also wrote works that your kind of aspiring chancery clerk. Right. Well, in the case of Ibn Qutaybah, Uyun al-Akhbar in particular, these kinds of manuals of Arabic culture, effectively compendia and anthologies. Right. So again, it's you don't want to overemphasize the distinction, but when Al-Jahid writes about the vices of the secretaries, and you have the Shu'ubi movement, this kind of anti-Arab quote-unquote movement in the third and fourth Islamic centuries.
Jahid writes about this in which of his texts?
I mean, the Rasail al-Jahid. Lots of relevant material. But I mean, it's. I don't want to get too off topic, but the key thing is in the Bukharan context, many of these distinctions that might be meaningful elsewhere are not meaningful in Bukhara. Poets were ulama, and bureaucrats received the madrasa training. Right. And emirs received the madrasa training with, training in the martial arts and all of these other things. Right. And this is what makes Bukharan scholarly culture so interesting, because there was this sharing of norms across the Persian cosmopolis. I should emphasize one point before we finish, and perhaps we'll have time for other things too.
Right.
Many have emphasized the disjunction between Persianate culture and the Islamic religious tradition, or have written of the Shahnameh, for instance, as a secular text. Right. It's something Pickett pushes against. Right. And he points out, just as a matter of historical observation, for instance, that Bukhara, prior to the Islamic period and its conquest by the Umayyads, was a center of Sogdian culture. The fact that Bukhara subsequently became a center of Persianate culture is a development that is a function of its integration to the Islamic world.
And I mean, in a sense, it could indicate that it had a lot of structures in place that allowed for that transformation, but it does indicate a transformation. If it's a center of one culture and it kind of transplants to a different culture.
Yes, and of course, an important role played by the sort of steppe empires, the Mongols and the Seljuks and so on, in allowing for the spread of this Persianate culture across a broad region. I mean, basically, you're talking everywhere outside the Arabophone world, and I suppose parts of Islamic Africa, where this was the case. And he doesn't refer to Shaykh Ahmed, but he does refer to, the same Persian poets being studied in Bukhara and in Sarajevo at the same time, which is a remarkable cultural find, of course, in India as well.
Yes, and the geographic distances that we're thinking are vast.
Yes,
and
this is why the term cosmopolis is so apt.
Right.
It was cosmopolitan, and of course, Pickett is very sensitive to the need to avoid anachronism and to deploy, because of course in the 19th and 20th centuries everything is refracted through the lens of nationalism, but the scholarly, the political elites were Turkic in the sense of their leading. It's not. I mean, anyway, there were these shared norms. That's the point I want to emphasize.
Thank you. And, we have about 3 minutes or so left. I wanted to perhaps give you the opportunity to think about if, what you, thought was a little weak in the book, perhaps.
That's a good question. And I know it follows on from some viewer suggestions we had. Yeah. I want to stress, I pick books that I think are particularly good and worth reading. And I want to encourage, viewers to take a look at them. So, that may explain why I don't dwell on criticisms. Both the
in terms of things which will take the scholarship forward. Yes. What aspects are perhaps lacking a little?
Honestly, with this book, it's very hard to say because
it's a rich text.
It is so original. It draws on lots of manuscript sources. It's the book that really becomes the stepping stone for future scholars who wish to write about this region.
Yes.
And partly for that reason, I really don't want to undermine what's being done here. I mean, I can't think of any factual errors. Of course, it's not my own area of expertise, and someone who did know more about the period would be able to comment more intelligently on that. But it's an excellent book, honestly, and
it unearths a period and a sort of a temporality and a geographic region which really has been a black hole in so many ways. And so to be able to do that so well with so much documentation, as you mentioned, and I got a taste of this as I was reading through the introduction as well.
It recalls that famous remark of attributed to Newton, at least, that we're standing. If we see further, it's because we stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, this book is really does help, of course, in conjunction with the works of many of Pickett's colleagues in Central Asian studies. It helps to lay a foundation, and it's not really for me, whose field of expertise it is not, but for a next generation of scholars, budding PhD students and future scholars who will no doubt build on the work and expand on its findings. But based on the state of the scholarship now and my own limited expertise, it's challenging and not. I don't think it would be very intelligent to. I can't think of any criticisms, honestly, and I don't make note of any in my notes on the book.
So we have a minute left, and I realized that we forgot to discuss prior to the session if you have a book selected for next week.
I do, and I remember to bring it with me. So
fantastic!
This is the very recent volume, Sharia, Justice and Legal Order, by the great Rudolf Peters, and this book came out very recently. I should stress that. It collects 35 previously published articles, so that there is not much new content except for a new introduction by a foreword, rather, by Rob Gleave, which kind of frames the contribution of Peters. And Peters needs no introduction. He's really one of the finest academics working on Islamic law, full stop. And the book focuses on primarily, and he writes about other things as well, but the transformation of Islamic law, particularly in Egypt in the 19th century, but he also discusses the 20th and even the 21st. He did quite a lot of important work on Nigeria from the 2000s onwards. So it's a fantastic book. And I had read many of his articles before, but having them all in one place and reading them all from beginning to end, of course, kind of does make you realize things and see things you hadn't seen before.
He's also, I mean, he is one of these scholars who's very difficult to keep up with because of the rate at which he writes. And so, I mean, I really look forward to actually finding I don't know if it's chronologically ordered. It's probably thematically ordered.
It's thematically ordered.
But I mean, it would be fascinating to, in a sense, trace his own sort of scholarly work over a period of time.
Yes, and Gleave helps to do that in the introduction as well.
Fantastic. So I really look forward to it. It looks like a bit of a beefy book, so to speak. But
yes, about 700 pages or so, but I have finished reading it.
Fantastic. So thank you, everyone, for sort of joining us this week. Thank you really primarily to yourself, Omar, for spending your time
thank you for having me.
Reading the text and explicating it in a way that is really very interesting and draws on so many other things that you're reading. And, you'll forgive me for interrupting you and asking you, okay, that author, who did they write? What text did they write? Can you give us a little bit more information? Just to encourage people, hopefully, to be reading a bit more sort of as they enjoy this 1 hour a week. They can take the opportunity to sort of delve into other areas of scholarship that they haven't previously explored. This week, we didn't spend quite as much time on the sort of my own theological musings, so to speak, but I hope
there was some of it. I think
there was some of that, and inevitably I brought in Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya. But I hope that this has been again an interesting and fruitful sort of conversation on the part of myself and Omar for our viewers. And inshallah, we look forward to you joining us next week to discuss Rudolf Peter's book. If you can just give me the title again, Omar.
Yes, this is Sharia, Justice and Legal Order, Egyptian and Islamic Law, Selected Essays.
Right. So it's a collection of Rudolf Peter's, the very prolific Rudolf Peter's sort of articles on Islamic law over a long period of time. And I'm sure this will be extremely interesting for us. And we will definitely not have enough time to cover all of the threads.
But there are key themes that emerge.
All right. Barakallah fikum, and I look forward to seeing everyone next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Farhan.